The smell of death has a texture. It's not just a scent, it's a presence. A thick, cloying gauze that settles over everything: the heavy velvet drapes, the mahogany bedposts, the very air you're forced to breathe. It smells of antiseptic, trying and failing to mask the deeper, darker aroma of failing organs and slow decay, of regret. That's the one they never tell you about. It smells like regret. I lay in the center of it all, propped up on a mountain of pillows that felt like concrete, a king presiding over a crumbling kingdom. My body was a traitor, a hollowed-out vessel of pain and exhaustion. But my mind, my mind was a razor, sharpened by 89 years of reading, of arguing, of building an empire from nothing but grit and a willingness to be ruthless. It was the last thing I had left, and today, I intended to use it one final time. They were all here, arrayed around my four-poster like a flock of vultures who'd taken etiquette lessons. My heirs. The word tasted like ash on my tongue. They thought this was a vigil, a waiting game. They thought they were here to watch the old lion die, to gently close my eyes, and then, with somber faces, rip the carcass of my life's work to pieces. They had no idea the lion had one last pounce in him. The soft, sniffling silence was broken by my lawyer, Charles, a man so dry he could be used as a desiccant. He cleared his throat, the sound like gravel shifting in a tin cup. "Kenneth," he said, his voice carefully modulated to a funereal hush, "the documents are all in order. We can proceed with the reading at the appropriate time. Perhaps it would be best if the family the reading," I interrupted, my voice a rusted hinge of its former boom, but it still cut through the sanctimonious quiet. "We will have our own reading, Charles. A different kind. Pull up a chair. You're the referee today." I saw the glances then, the quick, nervous flickers of eyes between my son, Robert, his wife Cynthia, my granddaughter Elara, and my nephew, Paul. The hyenas smelling a change in the wind. Robert leaned in, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Father, you're exhausted. You're not thinking clearly. This can wait. Let's just focus on you getting your rest." His tone was the same one he used to placate senile board members before he orchestrated their ousting. "My thinking has never been clearer, Robert," I said, fixing him with a gaze that made him flinch. "In fact, I've never been more certain of anything. For my entire life, I have been surrounded by people who wanted something from me. My money, my influence, my time. Today, you all get your final chance, but you're going to have to earn it." Elara, ever the dramatic one, let a single, perfect tear trace a path down her cheek. "Grandfather, please. We're here because we love you. This is so cruel." Cruelty is a subjective term. "My dear," I wheezed, pausing to draw a breath that felt like shards of glass in my chest. "It is often the label people give to honesty they'd rather not hear. So, let's be honest. You are not here for me. You are here for what I leave behind." And I find myself philosophically opposed to the notion of unearned inheritance. A stunned silence descended, thicker and heavier than the smell of death. "What are you saying, Kenny?" Paul asked, his voice a little too loud, a little too belligerent. He always called me Kenny, a pathetic attempt at faux camaraderie. "I am saying that the contents of my will are malleable," I said, watching the avarice light up in their eyes like neon signs. Charles made a strangled noise beside me. I silenced him with a look. "The lot of you, standing there, believe you have a right to what I built. I want to hear you justify that right. Not with emotional appeals, not with guilt. I want a logical, ethical argument. Persuade me, use reason, prove to me, here and now, that you deserve a single cent of my legacy." Robert laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "This is absurd. This is the morphine talking." Charles, for God's sake, Charles, pale and sweating, could only shrug. The documents are signed, but his mental competency. At this moment my mental competency, I seethed, summoning a last reservoir of strength to push myself up slightly, is the only thing in this room currently being measured in dollar signs. "So, who's first?" "Robert, you're the eldest, the firstborn son," Surely tradition and primogeniture must account for something. He glared at me, the mask of concern finally slipping. This was the real Robert, the one he'd seen crush competitors without a second thought. Good. I preferred him this way. Fine, father. You want logic. Here it is. I've worked by your side for 35 years. I've implemented your strategies, managed your assets, and increased the company's net worth by 400%. I have the experience, the knowledge, and the right temperament to steward your empire. To let it fall to anyone else, or to be broken up, would be illogical. It would be bad business. It would dishonor the work you've done. He sat back, smug. It was a good argument. Solid, corporate, clean. I let the silence hang, watching him squirm in it. An interesting thesis. Robert, I began, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost pedagogical tone. The Socratic method requires a certain calm. You speak of stewardship, of honoring my work. Let's examine that. The strategies you implemented, the hostile takeover of Sterling Mills, for instance. My strategy was to buy out the majority shareholders. Your implementation was to leak the fabricated scandal about the CEO's personal life to the press, driving the stock price into the ground and forcing a fire sale. Is that correct? Robert's face tightened. It was effective. It saved us millions. Effectiveness is not ethics, I said softly. We will get to business later. First, we are discussing honor. Did it honor my work? My name was built, initially, on a handshake. My word was my bond. It was only later that it became something else. But that initial capital, the social capital of trust, was the foundation. You traded that capital for a short-term gain. You tarnished the name you now wish to steward. Does a steward tarnish what he's meant to protect? That's a simplification, he protested, his cheeks flushing. The world isn't black and white. Business is brutal. Precisely, I agreed. And brutality is the antithesis of stewardship, which implies care, nurture, and a duty to something beyond one's self-interest. You argued you should inherit because you will be a good steward. But your own example reveals your primary guiding principle is not the health of the empire, but the bottom line. A bottom line that already belongs to you. So, your argument is circular. You should have it because you will make more of it for yourself. Where is the ethical duty in that? Where is the right? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I pressed on. Furthermore, you claim a right by virtue of your work, but you were paid, handsomely, for that work. A salary, bonuses, stock options. You received compensation for your labor. Is inheritance not, by its very definition, unearned? Are you now claiming double payment for a single span of work? How do you justify that ethically? Is it not a form of gluttony? Robert's fists were clenched on his knees. I am your son. Ah, I said, a spark of genuine pleasure cutting through the pain. Now we arrive at the crux. The emotional appeal, disguised as a logical one. Bloodline. So, your argument shifts. It is no longer about your merit as a steward, but your status as my progeny. Is that the foundation of your right? Simply the biological accident of your birth. It's not an accident, it's family. He snapped, his composure gone. Define family for me. Robert, is it a sacred bond of mutual support and unconditional love? If so, then remind me when your mother was dying in this very room. Was it support that kept you away for 3 weeks because of a critical merger in Singapore? Was it love that made you complain about the cost of her private nurses? You appeal to family now as a right, but you have consistently treated it as an obligation, an inconvenient one at that. Can one claim a right based on a concept one has consistently failed to honor? I was merciless, each question a hammer blow. He looked as if it struck him physically. The others in the room were frozen, their eyes wired with a mixture of terror and a horrific fascination. You can't throw that in my face, he whispered, his voice ragged. Why not? I asked, genuinely curious. You offer son as a justification for a transfer of wealth. I am merely examining the content of that term. If the title son is to have any meaning beyond the genetic, must it not imply a history of action, of duty, of love? Or do you believe the single act of being born confers a perpetual, unassailable right to another person's life's work, regardless of your subsequent conduct. Is that not the logic of a parasite? Robert stared at the floor, defeated. He had no answer. He had built his argument on a foundation of sand, and I had let the tide come in. No, I said, my energy beginning to wane again. The pain was returning, a dull, insistent throb. Then I dismiss your claim. You have not justified your right. You are not entitled. I turned my head slowly, the movement agony, until my gaze fell upon his wife, Cynthia. She had been quietly seething throughout my dismantling of her husband. Cynthia, your turn. Surely you have a claim. Justify it. She straightened her spine, a sleek panther ready to fight. Where Robert was blunt force, Cynthia was a scalpel. Kenny, she began, her voice syrupy sweet, a tone I knew well. This is also adversarial. We are not parasites. We are your legacy. What is this all for? She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, the estate beyond. If not for family. Robert may have his flaws, but he is your blood. I have stood by him. I have raised his children, managed his homes, hosted his parties. I have provided the stability and the social grace that allowed him to focus on the business you built. I have, in every way a partner can, contributed to the maintenance and growth of this family's wealth and status. She paused, letting her contribution hang in the air. It was a better argument than Robert's. It appealed to a subtler, often invisible, form of labor. So, I said, your argument is one of indirect contribution. You provided the domestic and social foundation that enabled Robert's work, and by extension, the work of my company. Therefore, you have a share in the results. Is that a fair summation? It is, she said, her chin held high. Let's explore the nature of that contribution, I said, falling back into the rhythm of inquiry. The stability you provided. Would that include the affair you conducted with your tennis instructor for the better part of 2010? Or does stability, in this context, have a different definition? Her face went bone white. How dare you? I dare because you are making an ethical claim, I said calmly. I am examining the facts. The social grace, the infamous Merry Christmas, your fired party, where you had security escort the Henderson family out because their daughter accidentally spilled wine on your gown. The grace that has alienated half of the city's old money. Is that the social lubricant you claim has benefited my empire? She was trembling with rage. You have no right to throw my past in my face. My contributions are real. I am not denying they are real, I countered. I am questioning their value and their motivation. You speak of family as a unified entity, but your actions, Cynthia, have consistently been about the elevation of one person, yourself. The parties, the homes, the social climbing, these were for your pleasure, your status. You did not do them for Robert, or for me. You did them for you. You are now retroactively applying a utilitarian framework to your own vanity. Is that not so? I was a part of this family, she insisted, her voice shrill. A part you played exceedingly well, I agreed. But let's push on the logic of your claim. If indirect contribution grants a right of inheritance, where do we draw the line? My secretary of 40 years, Agnes, has contributed vastly to my ability to work. Should she get a share? The janitor who kept my office clean, creating a productive environment, should he? Why does your contribution, which was ultimately self-serving, grant you a right, while theirs does not? Because you slept with my son. Is marriage, then, just a more legally complex form of employment? A job with a final, massive severance package? She looked at me with pure, undiluted hatred. I had reduced her life's work to a transactional performance. You are a vile, bitter old man, she spat. Perhaps, I conceded. But am I an illogical one? Have you justified your right? Or have you merely described the cost of doing business with you? She had no answer. Only tears of fury now. Not the calculated ones from before. I thought not, I sighed. Your claim is also dismissed. I was tired. So tired. The room was beginning to swim at the edges. But there were two more. I had to finish this. Elara, I croaked. My granddaughter. The artist. The free spirit. Come. Justify your right to the fruits of the capitalism you so publicly despise. She floated forward, all flowing fabrics and aggrieved innocence. She knelt by the bed, taking my limp, spotted hand in hers. Her touch was cold. "Grandfather," she said. Her voice a whisper meant to be intimate, but carrying to everyone. "I don't care about the money. You know that. I never have." It was a masterstroke, a claim of moral superiority through renunciation. "Then why are you here?" I asked, playing along. "For you," she said. "Another perfect year. Only for you." "But the topic at hand is inheritance," I reminded her. "If you don't care for it, then this exercise is moot for you. You can leave now." Content in your purity, a flicker of panic in her eyes. She hadn't expected that. She was trapped by her own performance. "I mean, of course, if it is your wish to provide for me, I would not refuse it," she backtracked gracefully. "But my argument isn't about want. It's about need. Not my need, grandfather. The world's need." "Go on." "The world is broken," she said, her voice gaining strength, falling into the well-rehearsed lines of 1,000 dorm room debates. "The system you built, with all due respect, is part of that. It's created inequality, exploitation, environmental degradation. This money, it's tainted. It has blood on it. But it doesn't have to be. I can purify it. I can use it for good. To fund grassroots movements, to support indigenous land rights, to create art that challenges the very system that created this wealth. I can turn this instrument of harm into an instrument of healing. That is my right. Not a right to have it, but a right to do good with it. An ethical obligation, even." It was brilliant. She wasn't claiming it for herself. She was claiming it as an agent for the greater good. She was positioning herself as the moral heir, the redeemer. I took a long, rattling breath. "This would require care." "A noble sentiment," I said. "So, your right is based on your proposed use of the capital. You will be a better custodian for society than, say, Robert, who would simply make more money." "Yes," she said, her eyes shining with fervent certainty. "Let's examine the premise," I began. "You say the money is tainted. By whose standard?" By any moral standard," she said, flustered. "Is morality not subjective? I believed I was providing jobs, creating value, building something that would last. I followed the laws of the land. By the standard of my time, I was a titan of industry, a philanthropist. Now, by the standard of your time, I am a villain. So, the taint is not an inherent property of the money, but a judgment you were placing upon it." "Correct, I suppose," she conceded warily. "So, you are not inheriting tainted money. You are inheriting money, and you are choosing to label it tainted. The money itself is neutral. It is at all. Your judgment is the value you add to it." She nodded, unsure where this was going. "Therefore," I continued, "your entire claim rests not on the money itself, but on the superiority of your judgment. You are arguing that your ethical framework is so superior to mine, to Robert's, to anyone else's, that you have a right to this tool to implement it. Is that fair?" "I wouldn't say superior, but you must," I insisted. "That is the logical foundation of your argument. Why else should you, and not another, direct its use? You believe your plan for it is ethically better. So, we must now examine your judgment." I paused, gathering the last of my strength. "Your art for the people collective. The grant money you secured from me. It was to fund a public installation about climate change, was it not?" "Yes," she said, proudly. It was a powerful statement. The statement was a 15-foot sculpture of a melting polar bear, made from recycled plastic, I said. The plastic was purchased new from a factory in China. The carbon footprint of its shipping alone was astronomical. The installation itself was held in a heated gallery. The opening party featured flown-in sushi and bottled water from Fiji. Where is the ethical judgment in that? It was a performance of concern, a piece of moral theatre that ultimately contributed to the very problems it purported to decry. Her mouth opened and closed. That's a gross mischaracterization. The art started a conversation. Conversations are cheap, I rasped. Hypocrisy is expensive. You speak of grassroots movements, but you have never lived outside a penthouse. You speak of indigenous rights, but you've never spent a week without a personal chef. You wish to use my money to fund your guilt, to pay for your own moral absolution through grand, symbolic gestures that change nothing. You are not a revolutionary, Elara. You are a tourist in the land of suffering. And you wish to use my money to buy the souvenirs. She recoiled as if slapped, snatching her hand back from mine. Your judgment, I concluded, my voice fading, is not superior. It is naive, inconsistent, unperformative. You have not demonstrated an ethical right to steward this wealth for the greater good. You have demonstrated only a desire to feel better about yourself. And that is the least compelling right of all. She was sobbing now, real, ugly sobs that shook her frame. The performance was over. Your claim is dismissed. The effort had cost me. Black spots danced in my vision. The pain was a constant, screaming fire now. I fought it, focusing on the last figure, Paul, my nephew, the forgotten one. Paul, I breathed, the word barely audible. He jumped, startled, had been hoping, perhaps, to be overlooked. He shuffled forward, a middle-aged man who had never quite found his place in the world. Uncle Kenny, he said, his voice soft, devoid of the aggression of the others. Justify your right, Paul. He looked down at his shoes, then around at the ruined faces of his family. He looked back at me, and in his eyes, I saw something the others lacked, a faint glimmer of empathy. I can't, Uncle Kenny, he said quietly. The simplicity of it shocked the room. Explain, I commanded. I don't have one, he said, shrugging with a profound sadness. A right? No, I didn't build this. I didn't help build it. I've just been around. In family, I guess. But that's not a right. That's just luck. Or bad luck, depending on how you look at it. He managed a weak smile. I'm not like them. I'm not smart like Robert, or clever like Cynthia, or passionate like Elara. I'm just Paul. I could say I need it. God knows I do. My business failed. I'm drowning in debt. That need isn't a right. It's just a state of being. He looked at me, and his gaze was clear, honest. You ask for logic and ethics. The only logical thing I can say is that I have no ethical claim. It's yours. You built it. You should do with it what you want, even if that's nothing. The silence in the room was absolute. He was the only one who hadn't come to steal, but to accept a gift, and in doing so, he had offered the only argument that approached integrity. I looked at him for a long time, at his honest, defeated face. I saw my sister in him, the only person I had ever truly loved. I felt a strange sensation, a settling. It was over. I looked at Charles and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then I turned my gaze to the rest of them, to the vultures with their plucked feathers and shattered beaks. You came here for a reading of the will, I whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. Here it is. You are all disinherited. Every last one of you. The entirety of my estate. Every company, every stock, every property. Every last dollar is to be liquidated. The proceeds will be used to establish a charitable foundation for adult literacy. I saw the looks of absolute horror, the utter disbelief. You can't do this, Robert roared, lunging forward. Charles moved to block him, his face grim. It is already done, I breathed. The documents were signed a week ago. This was just for me. The pain was receding now, replaced by a wonderful, floaty cold. I had done it. I had dismantled their greed, their hypocrisy, their sense of entitlement, and I had left them with nothing. Nothing but the truth. I looked past them, at the sunlight struggling through the dirty window. I had won my final argument. My last sight was of their faces, contorted in rage and despair, a perfect, beautiful portrait of avarice denied. And then, there was nothing. The silence that followed my last, gasping pronouncement was louder than any scream. It was a vacuum, sucking the air, the hope, the very future out of the room. I felt it, even as I felt myself detaching. The pain, my constant companion for months, was gone. The weight of the cancer-riddled body was gone. I was a point of consciousness, hovering somewhere near the ornate, water-stained ceiling, looking down. I had expected a final darkness, a nothingness. Not this. This lucid observation. Below me, the tableau was frozen. A museum diorama titled "The Moment the Money Died." Robert's face was a grotesque mask of purple fury. His body coiled as if to spring at the bed. At my corpse. Cynthia's perfectly composed features had shattered into a mess of incredulous rage. Her mouth a perfect, silent O. Elara had crumpled to the Persian rug, her body racked with sobs that seemed now to be less about grief and more about the sheer, universe-ending injustice of it all. Only Paul was still standing, his expression one of profound, weary shock. He wasn't looking at the others. He was looking at me, at the shell of me, and in his eyes there was no greed, only a deep, bewildered sorrow. Charles, my lawyer, was the first to break the spell. He cleared his throat, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the leather-bound folder had brought. The documentation, he began, his voice reedy and uncertain. Mr. Blackwood's instructions were explicit. The will you are all familiar with has been superseded. This, he tapped the folder, is the final, legally binding last testament and will of Kenneth Blackwood, executed 1 week ago today with myself, and to independent medical professionals attesting to his soundness of mind. Soundness of mind, Robert roared, finding his voice. It was a raw, animal sound. He jabbed a finger at the bed. Look at him. Look at this charade. He was delirious, drugged to the gills. You can't possibly expect that to hold up in court. Charles flinched but held his ground. The physician's affidavits are included here. Robert, they are unequivocal. His cognitive faculties were, against all odds, entirely intact. His directives are legal and enforceable. Enforceable. Cynthia shrieked, finding her voice. It had lost all its cultured syrup and was now pure, undiluted venom. Hayes giving everything away. To adult literacy. That's not a directive. That's the rambling of a madman. Well, fight this, Charles. Well, bury you and your firm in litigation until the sun burns out. You are, of course, within your rights to challenge the will, Charles said, his professionalism returning, a wall against their fury. However, I must advise you that Mr. Blackwood anticipated such a challenge. He has set aside a separate, considerable fund specifically to finance the legal defense of his final wishes. It will be a long, expensive, and almost certainly futile battle. The genius of it, even I had to admire it from my new vantage point. I hadn't just cut them off, it built a fortress around my decision, with lawyers as its garrison. They wouldn't just be fighting a will, they'd be fighting a perpetual motion machine of legal defense funded by the very fortune they were trying to claim. Elara scrambled to her feet, her tears gone, replaced by a fiery, self-righteous anger. He can't do this. It's unethical. It's a waste. That money could save the world. And Hayes pouring it into a black hole of lawyers and reading lessons. It's a final act of spite from a man who never understood true morality. Paul finally spoke, his voice quiet but cutting through the din. He understood it well enough to see through all of us, didn't he? 3 pairs of furious eyes snapped toward him. Don't you dare, Robert snarled. Don't you dare side with him, you pathetic leech. You're getting nothing too. I know, Paul said, his shoulders slumping. I told him I didn't have a right. I meant it. I'm just him, just seeing it clearly. He saw this coming. He saw all of us, lined up here, just waiting. And he decided none of us were worthy. And you know what? He was right. His words were a truth bomb that left a different kind of silence in its wake. It was one of shame, quickly buried by more rage. Get out, Robert hissed at Charles. Get out of my father's house. It is not your house, Robert, Charles said coolly. Not yet. And according to these documents, it never will be. The property is to be sold, and the proceeds go to the foundation. I will need you all to vacate the premises within 48 hours. The estate's executors will be here in the morning to begin the inventory and liquidation process. The sheer, brutal finality of it, the eviction notice delivered moments after my death, was the masterstroke. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the homes, the cars, the art, the very identity they had wrapped themselves in. I was stripping them of their costumes. Charles gathered his papers, gave a curt nod to the room, and left, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch seemed to unlock their fury anew. What followed was a symphony of avarice undone. Robert paced like a caged tiger, spewing vitriol about lawsuits, incompetent doctors, and a lifetime of slights. Cynthia was on her phone, her voice shrill, already calling her own army of lawyers, her words a tangled mess of threats and financial jargon. Elara was preaching to the room, a sermon about the moral imperative to overturn this travesty, her rhetoric already shifting from grief to the language of a hostile takeover of my philanthropic intentions. And Paul just stood there, watching them. Then he walked to the bed. He looked down at my body, my eyes still open, staring at the ceiling where I, ironically, now resided. He reached out a hesitant hand and closed them. "Goodbye, Uncle Kenny," he murmured. "You certainly knew how to make an exit." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the others to their spiraling chaos. He was the first to accept it, the only one. I expected my consciousness to fade then, to be drawn into whatever comes next. But it didn't. I remained, a ghost in the machine of my own making. I was tethered to the money, to the outcome, to the sheer, spectacular fallout of my last great project. I found I could move, not with legs, but with intention. I drifted out of the bedroom, following the sounds of the coming storm. The next 48 hours were a spectacle of human farce. My death was announced. The vultures didn't just circle, they descended into a feeding frenzy of panic. I watched Robert in his study, now my study, draining a bottle of my best Macallan, while screaming at his phone, trying to rally his board members, his allies, only to be met with a sudden, cold pragmatism. Why back a horse that had just lost the only race that mattered? I saw the realization dawn on him. His power was derivative. It came from being my heir. Without that, he was just a competent, but replaceable, executive. Cynthia's social calls were even more revealing. Her dearest friends were suddenly unavailable, their condolences thin and laced with a palpable, gossipy thrill. She was already becoming a pariah, a symbol of failed ambition. The invitations would dry up, the deference would vanish. She was facing a social death, and it terrified her more than the financial one. Elara took to social media, a move of stunning idiocy. She posted a gauzy, filtered photo of herself from happier times, with me in the garden. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive virtue, processing an immense loss. My grandfather was a complex man. His final wishes, made in illness, seemed to contradict a lifetime of belief in family. We will honor his true legacy, not the shadows of his last days. Family first, legacy love. The comments were a bloodbath. Some offered support. Many others, likely people who knew her or knew of her, posted laughing emojis, or cryptic messages, like "guess the trust fund dried up," or "time to get a job." The facade was cracking, and the internet was hammering at the fractures. I floated through the house, a silent witness to the dismantling of a dynasty. The staff, loyal 4 decades, were already receiving calls from Charles' office. They were being let go with generous severance packages. Another one of my final instructions. I saw the housekeeper, Maria, crying in the kitchen, not for her job, but for me. "Elvie Josior," she whispered to the cook. "Iridoro, Paro tenor and corazon, all final. Solo querique fueron mayores personas." The old master was hard, but he had a heart. In the end, he just wanted them to be better people. If only she knew. My heart had little to do with it. It was about the principle, the logic. The executors arrived, a cold, efficient trio from a firm that specialized in dissolving empires. They moved through the house like surgeons, tagging items, taking inventories, their clinical detachment a stark contrast to the emotional maelstrom of my family. I watched Robert try to assert authority, to claim a particular painting, a desk. "These are family heirlooms," he insisted. "Everything in this house is part of the estate, sir," the lead executor replied, her voice devoid of inflection. "It will all be appraised and sold. You are welcome to bid on any items at the public auction." The humiliation was exquisite. He would have to buy his own childhood home at auction. The eviction was swift and brutal. Suitcases were packed. Tears were shed real ones, this time of self-pity and rage. They stood on the grand driveway, next to their luxury cars, which were also part of the estate, and would be repossessed, looking back at the house like refugees. It was then that the press arrived. A few vans, tipped off by God knows who, probably Cynthia, hoping for a sympathetic angle. The cameras filmed them, the disgraced, disinherited family, cast out into the cold. Robert ducked into a hired car, hiding his face. Cynthia tried to compose herself, offering a strained, tragic smile that looked more like a grimace. Elara, ever the performer, walked straight toward the cameras, her face a mask of dignified grief. I could almost hear her preparing her statement about healing and carrying on her grandfather's true legacy. They were gone. The silence that settled over the estate was profound. It was no longer a home, it was asset, empty, waiting. And still, I remained. The weeks that followed were a strange, detached dream. I was there for the auction, a spectral guest as strange as picked over the bones of my life. My favorite armchair, the desk where I built my first company, my wife's jewelry all went to the highest bidder. There was a certain cleansing purity to it. These objects, so laden with meaning for me, were just objects to them. They were being freed of their baggage. The legal challenges began, just as Charles had predicted. Robert, Cynthia, and Elara, in a fragile and hateful alliance, pulled their remaining resources to fight. But my legal fortress held. Every motion was countered. Every challenge met with a thicker stack of paperwork and a more expensive lawyer funded by the defense trust. The case was laughed out of the lower courts. They appealed. It became a grinding, expensive war of attrition that they were destined to lose. I watched their hope turn to desperation, then to a bitter, exhausted resentment. I saw Paul. Had rented a small, modest apartment. Had found a job, a middling management position in a small manufacturing firm, well beneath his experience, but enough to live on. He seemed quieter, calmer. One evening, he was in his kitchen, making a simple dinner, and he stopped. He looked out the window at the setting sun, and he smiled, a small, genuine thing. "You crazy old bastard," he said to the empty air, to me. "You were right. It's quieter now." He was the only one who had found any peace in the ruin it created. Months bled into a year. The foundation was established. The Kenneth Blackwood Foundation for Adult Literacy and Basic Education. I'd chosen it not for some sudden philanthropic urge, but because it was the exact opposite of everything my life had been about. It was quiet, unglamorous, foundational. It helped people read, to fill out job applications, to understand a lease agreement. It was undramatic, essential work. I found myself drawn to its offices, a nondescript building in a part of town I'd never visited in life. I watched the people who came in, their faces etched with shame and hope. I saw the tutors, patient and kind. I saw the moment when a middle-aged man slowly sounded out a sentence in a children's book, and his face lit up with a triumph I'd never seen on any of my board members' faces after a multi-million-dollar deal. It was satisfying, in a way I hadn't anticipated. My family, meanwhile, continued to unravel. Robert and Cynthia's marriage, a partnership of convenience and ambition, shattered under the financial strain. They divorced with a bitterness that made the court battles over my will look civilized. Robert, stripped of his title and his wealth, was just another angry middle-aged man. The industry that had once feared him now pitied him. He drank too much. Cynthia, her social capital spent, moved to a smaller city, trying to reinvent herself, but forever haunted by the ghost of the life she'd lost. Elara's social justice crusade collapsed without the fuel of my money to fund it. Her collective disbanded. She was forced to actually get a job, and the reality of work, the grind, the indignity of a boss, the lack of time for meaningful conversation crushed her spirit. She became cynical, lashing out at the very causes she'd once championed, calling them unrealistic and naive. The hypocrisy was complete. I had not just taken their money, I had taken their identities, I had proven that without the foundation of my wealth, the characters they had played were just that, characters. And without a stage, they had nothing to perform. And through it all, I watched. I was a ghost, but I was not at peace. There was a lingering question, a final, loose thread. I had dismantled their arguments. I had exposed their flaws. I had proven my point with the brutal finality of a philosopher's axiom. But as I watched the quiet, good work of the literacy foundation and the loud, pathetic failures of my bloodline, a new thought began to form. Had I been ethical? Or had I just been logical? I had acted as judge, jury, and executioner. I had used my final moments to deliver a punishment, dressed in the robes of philosophical inquiry. I had wanted to teach them a lesson. But can a lesson taught with such cruelty, such finality, ever truly be learned? Or does it only breed bitterness? Socrates asked questions to guide his students to truth. I had asked questions to guide my heirs to a preordained destruction. Was that philosophy? Or was it just the last, greatest act of vengeance from a man who had built his life on it? The question kept me tethered, a ghost not just in the world, but in my own conscience. One afternoon, a year and a half after my death, I was drifting through the Foundation's main classroom. A tutor was working with a young woman, helping her fill out her application for a nursing program. It was painstaking, difficult work. The woman was frustrated, on the verge of tears. "I can't do this," she whispered. "It's too hard. I'm too stupid." The tutor, a woman in her 60s named Brenda with infinite patience, put a hand on hers. "No, you're not. It's hard because it's new. It's a new language. But you're learning it. Look how far you've come. This isn't a measure of what you can't do. It's a measure of what you're choosing to overcome." The woman took a breath, nodded, and went back to the form, her hand steadier. And in that moment, I understood my failure. I had given my heirs a test they were destined to fail. I had presented them with a foreign language, the language of ethics and logic, and when they couldn't speak it fluently, I had condemned them for it. I hadn't been a teacher. I hadn't been a guide. I had been an executioner. Socrates' method was about dialogue, about the shared pursuit of truth. Mine had been a monologue, a final lecture from a dying king. I hadn't wanted them to learn. I had wanted to win. The realization was my final, quiet death knell. I felt the tether loosen, the need to observe, to judge, to witness the aftermath of my victory, faded. It had been a hollow victory. I had bested them in argument, but I had lost something of myself in the process. My soul, perhaps. My chance to truly leave something behind that wasn't just a negative space. I took one last look at the classroom, at the woman struggling with her form, at the tutor offering not condemnation, but support. This was the legacy, not the grand, dramatic act of disinheritance, but the quiet, patient act of helping someone read. I had, in my own twisted, flawed way, made it possible, but I would never know if it justified the means. That was a question for the living. I felt myself dissolving, not into nothingness, but into a final, profound silence. The last thought I had was not of my money, or my empire, or my brilliant, brutal logic. It was of Paul, smiling softly in his small kitchen, and the simple, unanswerable truth he had spoken. "You crazy old bastard." And then, I was gone. The silence after my dissolution wasn't an emptiness. It was a suspension, a breath held by the universe itself. I was nowhere and everywhere, a thought without a thinker. But a question, the one it died with, remained, an unspoken ripple in the fabric of whatever this was. Had I been ethical, or just logical? The question was a hook, and it caught. The nothingness resisted, then yielded. I wasn't pulled back to the world of the living, was reconstituted within it, my consciousness coalescing around a point of intense, familiar emotion. It wasn't my own. It was rage. I found myself in a cramped, beige-walled office. The air smelled of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. Robert was sitting behind a cheap particle board desk, his face a thundercloud. He was staring at a computer screen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. This wasn't the corner office with the skyline view. This was a rented suite in a nondescript business park, the kind of place for failing insurance agencies and struggling realtors. On the screen was a news article. The headline glowed with a mocking cheerfulness. Blackwood Literacy Foundation announces nationwide expansion, reaching 100,000 learners. There was a photo of the foundation's director, a woman I recognized as one of the efficient executors, cutting a ribbon at a new center. She was smiling. The people around her were smiling. Robert's rage was a physical thing, a heat I could feel from my non-corporeal vantage point. It was so much more potent than the corporate anger I'd seen from him in life. This was primal, humiliated, and desperate. Had spent the last of his liquid assets, and what was left of his credibility, on the legal battle. Had lost. The appeals were exhausted. The fortress had held. This was his life now. A consultancy. Robert Blackwood, strategic business advisor. The phone on his desk hadn't rung in a week. The framed photo on the desk wasn't of Cynthia or his children. It was an old picture of him and me, taken on a fishing trip when he was 12. He was beaming, holding up a small trout. I had my hand on his shoulder, a rare, unguarded smile on my face. He picked up the frame, his hand trembling. For a moment, I thought he would dash it against the wall. Instead, his shoulder slumped. The rage leaked out of him, replaced by a suffocating wave of despair. He wasn't thinking about ethics or logic. He was thinking about that trout, about the hand on his shoulder. He was thinking about a version of me that was gone, and a version of himself that was gone with it. He hadn't learned a lesson about entitlement. Had just been broken. My brilliant, logical victory had not created a more ethical man. It had created a hollowed out one. The truth of it was a cold shock. My first premise that this ordeal would improve them was flawed. The hook of my question tugged again. I was ripped from Robert's silent misery and plunged into a different kind of atmosphere. Frenetic, loud, clattering. A restaurant kitchen. Heat, steam, the sizzle of grease, shouted orders. And there was Elara, her hair tied back in a messy bun, a splatter of sauce on her cheek. She was moving with a frantic, exhausted efficiency, assembling salads, wiping plates, her face set in a permanent scowl. This wasn't a chic cafe where she discussed artisanal ingredients. This was a chain steakhouse on a highway off-ramp. Blackwood, order up. Stop daydreaming. A thick-necked cook barked at her. The flash of indignation on her face was pure, undiluted Elara. For a second, I saw her gathering herself for a lecture on respect, workers' dignity. But the moment passed. Her shoulders slumped, identical to Robert's. She grabbed the plates and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of resentment. She wasn't contemplating the ethical dimensions of my will. She was thinking about her aching feet. She was calculating if she could make rent this month. She was seething at the customers who left tiny tips, at the manager who leered at her, at the universe that had placed her here. Her passion for the people had curdled into a bitter hatred for the specific people who wanted extra ranch dressing. The money Shed once wanted to use to save the world was now a mythical concept, a dream that only made her present reality more unbearable. She hadn't been purified by poverty. She had been embittered by it. Another failure. My logic had been impeccable, but it had failed to account for the human spirit's capacity for spite, for the way hardship can shrink a person's world until it contains only their own misery. Another tug. A different scene. A tastefully bland living room for her small apartment. Cynthia was on a video call, her face a mask of strange cheerfulness. She was talking to a woman I recognized, Margot, once her closest friend, a fellow socialite. And so, if decided to become a certified life coach, Cynthia was saying, her voice a brittle parody of her old confidence. I have so much experience managing high-pressure situations, curating lifestyles. I really think I can help people. On the screen, Margot's smile was thin, patronizing. How wonderful for you, Cynthia. It's so important to find a purpose. The pause was deliberate, vicious. I'm sure you'll be a great help to whoever. I could feel the heat of Cynthia's humiliation. She was selling her past, packaging the tattered remnants of her status as a commodity. She was a ghost haunting her own life, trying to convince others, and herself, that she was still relevant. The conversation was a dance of subtle knives, each of Margot's words a tiny cut reminding Cynthia of where she was not, at the galas, the openings, the places that defined her. When the call ended, Cynthia's smile vanished. She didn't cry. She just sat in the sterile silence of the rented apartment, a monument to her own exile. Her argument had been about social grace, about being the hidden engine of the family's ascent. I had dismantled that argument, but I hadn't considered what would be left when the engine was ripped out. There was no core, only a vacuum. My grand experiment was a catastrophic failure. I had examined their arguments and found them wanting. I had provided the conclusive proof. But proof of what? That they were flawed. I already knew that. I was flawed. Everyone is. I hadn't offered a path to improvement. I had only offered a punishment. I had been a philosopher king who confused a sentencing hearing for a seminar. The hook pulled me once more, but this time it was gentler. A public library. The quiet was a living thing, broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the hum of computers. And there was Paul. He wasn't a patron. He was a volunteer. He was sitting at a small table with a man in his 50s, his hands rough and calloused, his face etched with a lifetime of hard work. They were bent over a workbook. "Okay, Frank," Paul said, his voice low and encouraging. "This one's tricky. Think about it. It's like through a ball, but it means going from one side to the other." Frank grunted, frustrated. "The letters get all jumbled up." "I know," Paul said. "They do for me, too. Sometimes. Let's sound it out." I didn't just see them. I felt the space between them. There was no performance here, no expectation. There was only patience and a shared, quiet struggle. Paul wasn't here out of guilt or a desire for moral absolution. He was here because he had spare time on a Tuesday evening and had seen a flyer. His argument had been that he had no right to my money. His actions now were a quiet continuation of that truth. He was building something for himself that had nothing to do with me. After the session, as Frank shook his hand with a grateful, "See you next week, Paul," I watched my nephew pack up his things. He walked out into the cool evening air and stopped on the library steps, taking a deep breath. He looked content, not happy, not successful in any way I would have measured it, but content. He had been stripped of everything, including the weight of expectation. He was free. In that moment, I understood the flaw in my entire Socratic endgame. Socrates did not seek to win. He sought understanding. He questioned his students not to expose them for flaws, but to guide them toward discovering their own ignorance, which is the first step toward wisdom. His goal was not victory, but enlightenment. My goal had been victory. I had used the form of his method, the relentless questioning, but I had weaponized it. I had not wanted them to discover their own flaws. I had wanted to catalogue them for them, to prove my own superiority one final time. I was not a philosopher. I was a prosecutor and a hanging judge. My ethics had been a sham. I had preached a doctrine of earned inheritance while acting out the ultimate unearned privilege, the right to sit in final, absolute judgment. My logic was sound, but it was built on a foundation of profound ethical hypocrisy. The realization was my final, true death. The lingering consciousness that was me, the ghost tethered by my own hubris and unresolved question, began to unravel completely. But this time, it was different. It was not a dissolution into nothingness, but an integration, understanding. I was not going to watch them anymore. My time for observation, for judgment, was over. It had always been the wrong role to play. A final, overwhelming urge took hold of me not to speak, not to intervene, but to let go, to release the last vestiges of my will, my control, my need to dictate the outcome. I focused everything I had left, not on a person, but on the foundation itself, the Kenneth Blackwood Foundation for Adult Literacy, the receptacle of my wealth, the monument to my final, flawed act. I pushed toward it not with a command, but with a relinquishment, a blessing, a final, silent amendment to my will. Let it be used for good, not as a monument to me, or to my anger, but for them, for the Franks of the world. Let it be a thing of patience, not punishment. I felt something shift. It wasn't in the physical world. It was in the metaphysical architecture of the foundation's purpose. The intention behind the money, which had been born of spite, was purified, neutralized. It was just money now, a tool. The energy I had imbued it with, my lingering, controlling presence, evaporated, and with that, I was finally, truly, free. The last thing I perceived was not a sight or a sound, but a feeling. It was the feeling of Frank's calloused hand, as he successfully wrote the word through of his application for a better job. It was the quiet satisfaction of Paul walking home in the twilight. It was the moment of understanding in a library, far from the smell of death and money. It was a small thing, infinitely smaller than the empire I had built, but it was real. My story doesn't have a happy ending. Robert's consultancy failed. He drifted into alcoholism and died alone a decade later. The photo of the trout, the only thing on his bedside table. Cynthia's life coaching business never took off. She lived out her days in genteel poverty, forever bitter, her world shrinking to the size of her television screen. Alara worked a series of dead-end jobs, her artistic dreams and moral fervor extinguished by the grinding need to pay bills. She became exactly the kind of person she had once claimed to want to help, and she hated every minute of it. The foundation, however, thrived. It quietly, effectively, changed tens of thousands of lives. It never bore my name in a way that felt celebratory. It was just a name on a letterhead, a source of funds for good works. The irony, I had intended giving my capitalist wealth to a humble cause, was forgotten. The money was just useful. And Paul kept his job. He never married. He never had children. He volunteered at the library every Tuesday for the rest of his life. He lived a simple, small life of quiet decency. He was the only one who ever truly understood the lesson. Not because I taught it to him, but because he had already learned it before he ever walked into my deathbed chamber. He died in his sleep at the age of 72. His apartment was clean, tidy, and unremarkable. The only thing of note was a single book on his bedside table. It was a well-worn copy of Plato's Apology, the account of Socrates' trial and death. Inside the front cover, in his neat, unassuming handwriting, he had written, "For Uncle Kenny, who asked all the right questions for all the wrong reasons. I hope you found your answer." I finally had. The answer was that logic without empathy, just a more complicated form of cruelty, and that the right to judge is the one inheritance no one ever earns.